It's really a pleasure to get to moderate such a great panel, and I think a very timely and hopefully beneficial one. I'll get right into it and start out by asking each of you just to give us a short and try to keep it relatively short, 3-4 minutes, definition of what kind of role fear and anxiety play in our lives, and also what's the difference between fear and anxiety. And if you'd like, we could start with Tenzin Chogkyi.
Thanks, Scott, and thanks to Marco and the whole team for inviting us. I'm really looking forward to this dialogue, and great to be here with all of you. And so I think it's interesting in a modality that I teach called cultivating emotional balance. We get away from talking about negative and positive emotions because that sort of indicates that there's some emotions that are okay and some that are not okay. And the ones that don't feel good are negative emotions, and we try to avoid them. But fear, of course, is a very important emotion, and we definitely don't want to get rid of fear. Fear is something we evolved to experience that helps actually protect us from danger. Fear is a response to danger, and it helps protect us, helps us take care of ourselves and take care of others. So the goal is definitely not to eliminate an emotion like fear. In fact, I think, I often say our ancestors wouldn't have survived long enough to be our ancestors if they didn't have a full emotional repertoire, including definitely fear, right? They wouldn't have survived. It helps us survive. And so it's response to a threat, one possible response to a threat. Some researchers and psychologists like to differentiate fear from anxiety in this way, and they say that fear is response to a threat, an existing immediate threat, and anxiety is more of a response to a threat that might be anticipated or expected or imagined, right? So sometimes that differentiation is made. And then, of course, in terms of, and we'll talk about this a little bit later on, in terms of, what we might call a constructive response to a threat versus a destructive response. And one of the things that, we human beings have for our benefit, but it can be a detriment, is an imagination. And so sometimes we can imagine threats or exaggerate threats with our imagination that aren't real, even the immediate ones, or definitely the anticipated and expected ones. So, in short, fear and even anxiety can be constructive and can definitely have a function, and can cause a lot of disconnection between ourselves and others, can make us live in very limited ways if there's ways that they're distorted and exaggerated. Yeah, thank you.
Rabbi Eilberg, do you want to share?
Sure. This is first my thanks also for the invitation, and a pleasure to sit with these people that I know, and then others, new friends, for such a rich and important topic. And as I told my fellow speakers when we got together for a bit to prepare for this, I'm an expert on anxiety, and I don't mean that I have a degree in it, which I don't, but I have a lot of daily experience of it. So it's really fun to take a deep, thoughtful dive into it. So I pretty much agree with everything Tenzin said. I usually do. I think I just with a slight nuance. I'm inclined to say that fear generally it relates to a more specific threat, a more known and understood threat, as opposed to anxiety, which is not only unknown, but maybe even unspecified, which is really more generalized. So and poorly defined. So that which is why fear is, of course, as Tenzin said, a basic survival mechanism. The problem is that the limbic portion of the brain, the more ancient part of the brain, for a good evolutionary reasons, to protect us, sometimes overreacts to stimuli that generate fear. So Rick Hansen, the psychologist and meditation teacher, has this wonderful vignette of you walking along a path in the woods, and you see a very long, narrow object, and the limbic portion of the brain goes, ah, it's a snake, it could be poisonous, whatever. And then at a certain point, and the theory is that it's a fraction of a second, though in my experience, it's a lot longer than a fraction of a second. At a certain point, the more frontal and more advanced areas of the brain kick in to say, wait, let me just check. Is it really a snake, or is it a stick, which is also long and narrow? In the meantime, my heart is racing, right? Because the body has set in motion the needed survival responses to presence of real danger. So the theory is, at least, that fear can then subside when the whole brain or the whole being becomes convinced that what stands before us is not really so dangerous, as opposed to anxiety, which is kind of it's kind of a generalized state of vigilance, or sometimes hypervigilance. I'm not sure whether I see it as functional, as useful. I really need to think about that some more. I think of anxiety as that generalized kind of anxiety is the mistaken action of the limbic system to keep the body in the state of, to put it simply, fight, flight, or freeze, thinking that there's a mortal danger standing before us, when in fact it's just a traffic jam or a nasty interaction with a friend or whatever. And I just want to say one other thing to put in the circle. I think anxiety in particular, although sometimes fear, as I said, relates to a threat that's in the present. Anxiety, I think, almost always relates to something imagined, as Tenzin said, something in the future. So, which hints at contemplative practice, constructive, helpful contemplative practice in response to anxiety, which is that whenever one grounds oneself in the body and in the present moment, the threat is not actually here. So that's enough for now.
Zach.
Thanks so much, Scott and Marco. It's an honor to be here with you, and also Rabbi Amy and Tenzin and the audience. I came across a study that was published through the LA Times that said that over 2/3 of young adults here in California experience anxiety, and over half depression. So in addition to COVID, we're concerned about, the cost of housing, healthcare, college, as well as a lack of well-paying jobs. My 6-year-old daughter also told me she's worried about climate change. She's just starting to learn about it. And unfortunately, that is turning into a kind of fear. And perhaps we'll speak about this later, but I do think that's rational. To this, we can add the fear of war, especially nuclear war, which is an ever-present danger. And then we also have fears and anxieties, and often the avoidance of, let's call it of life after death. Have we led meaningful and ethical lives? And are we prepared to meet our Creator? And what happens when we address our material needs and concerns, but not our spiritual well-being and the needs of the heart? Going back to this fundamental question, I agree with Tenzin and Rabbi Amy. Some fears, such as the threat of danger or death, can be useful. They warn us in the face of real or potential harm to be careful. Anxiety is also real, especially from the mental or physical perspective or state of the person experiencing it. However, its causes may be found on the emotional or psychological level. And like Rabbi Amy, I also have some experience with this. So hopefully I'll get to share some practical methods that I've found useful. They may not be for everyone, but they've helped me.
I wonder if we could go into that, talking about constructive and destructive ways of working with fear and anxiety. I mean, if it's on the tip of your mind, Zachary, you could you could continue.
Sure. So, well, it sort of relates to, turning to specific contemplative practices that I found useful. And so when I was an adolescent and young man, I used to have pretty severe anxiety attacks. And during one of these episodes, I got up and made the ritual ablution with water that we do before prayer in Islam. And I began to make this optional prayer. And it begins with raising your hands above your head and saying, Allahu Akbar, God is great. And as soon as I lifted my hands, the anxiety left me. It was remarkable. And then there's another contemplative practice that's also somewhat well known in Islam and in the mystical tradition of Sufism, known as dhikrullah, or the remembrance or invocation of God. And it's understood that the sacred is sort of qualified with certain names: the compassionate, the merciful, the source of peace, as-salam, for example. And when we invoke these, they become direct openings to the one who's named, including in the heart. So this practice, there's a Quranic verse that relates to it, which is only in the remembrance of God do hearts find rest. So in the remembrance of compassion, of mercy, of peace, of all of these qualities, which are really woven into our heart, our true nature. When we remember these names, then we're in a way more connected to them.
Yeah, Tenzin Chogkyi, what about some of the ways we deal with constructively and destructively deal with fear and anxiety, from the Buddhist perspective, and also some of your, I know you know some of the clinically proven methods too.
Yeah, right. So it's interesting. So as I said, I think both fear and anxiety, and this will be interesting to talk about more, especially in terms of anxiety, can manifest either constructively or destructively. And so for fear, if it causes us to, be cautious when there's a real danger, remove ourselves from danger, get ourselves to safety, care for ourselves and others in a certain way, that's constructive. And then there's ways I think that fear can manifest destructively when we think about our response to threat. And Amy mentioned this limbic system, and we talk about the amygdala, which is one of the structures in the brain that responds. We often think of fight or flight. There's also freeze. There's also a few other responses: appease, collapse, submit. So when we think of flight, for example, it obviously includes, physically running away. But I think flight for us in the face of fear and anxiety can include distraction. And we just refuse to think about what's happening and the threats. And we, binge watch or get on our devices or do all of the things. That's one way of flight. And then I think, for fighting, we can just get really reactive and just, angry at everything, really kind of, anger that's not at all a constructive response. And then freeze. And I think this is a very dysfunctional response. Also, especially to anxiety, is we just feel that there's nothing we can do. We maybe retreat from any novel experiences, go into some sort of isolation, go into apathy. That could either be a freeze response or a collapse response. And I think, we mentioned the climate crisis, and I think anxiety about the future impacts. I would think we could have a positive anxiety that makes us go, okay, in the future, I expect that there are going to be these threats that will manifest even more than they have already. And then it motivates us to take action, right? That could be a constructive anxiety. We're not in denial. We're not going into fight, flight, freeze. We're actually facing up and going, okay, if we do something now about it, so that could be constructive. But then, of course, the very destructive anxiety would just be, there's nothing I can do. It's, capitalism, big corporations, politicians, there's nothing I can do. So I'm just going to shut down. And I found that actually about 10 years ago, I was giving a presentation on eco-anxiety, this new kind of psychological trend that was being talked about a lot at a conference. And as my very unscientific study, I asked a lot of friends what their response was to the climate crisis. And I selected people I thought were very engaged and very thoughtful and very, awareness practices. These were Buddhist friends because it was a Buddhist conference. So many of my friends were like, I can't think about it. I try not to think about it. And this was about 12 years ago. And I was like, wow, even these people who are contemplatives that I think are also socially engaged, even for them, they're like, nope, too overwhelming, don't know what to do, can't do anything about it. So that would definitely be a destructive, response. And then in Buddhist contemplation, for me, the key is what in Buddhism we talk about interdependence, or the law of cause and effect, that our actions are never wasted. And so that gives us a sense of agency and can kind of overcome that despair and apathy. If we think, we talk about karma or cause and effect, and we say, no, whatever actions we take, we may not see the impact, we may not see the outcome, even in our lifetime, but it's not wasted. And so that gets us out of that stuck, freeze, apathy, despair response that we can so easily go into. So that's just one of the strategies. It's kind of a reappraisal or a reframe that comes from Buddhism. Thinking about impermanence, things are changing all the time, and that our actions that we take definitely cumulatively, right? And then that's the interconnection also, is like, if we all act together, we can have an effect on the outcome.
Yeah, and Rabbi Eilberg.
Yeah, I'll go back to to Scott, to your question about personal practice, like what do I do as informed by the Jewish contemplative tradition? So that's sort of zooming out from the specifics of specific fear responses, Tenzin, that you were talking about. I think in Musar, one Jewish tradition of spiritual development, the notion of choice is very important. Bringing awareness to moments that are choice points, that normally we go along our lives, in moments, without awareness, and things just unfold, and it's as if, this is just how it has to be. So the hardest part for me of finding constructive or helpful or soothing response to anxiety is remembering that I have a choice, that I don't have to be in the grip of this. And I must say, a lot of the time, I just feel like I'm in the grip of it, and I'm driven by it, right? My decisions are made not with conscious awareness, but driven by sometimes a strong physiologic impulse that's born of fear or anxiety. But once I have remembered to stop and notice and bring the attention inward and invoke mindfulness, I notice what's happening in my body, I notice that fear is here or anxiety is here, then I have a whole range of possible responses. And that's easy, like there's a whole list of them. The hard part is remembering to take the pause. So among the things that are helpful, some physiologic things, this is, I think, a response to trauma. I just recently read about a practice of tracing each of your fingers It's really just a way to take a contemplative pause and to focus the attention on, on something else, or look around the room and find 5 brown things, in the course of which I'm breathing and I'm not feeding the anxious story and so on. So there are lots of ways in which bringing attention to the body are helpful. There's a whole tradition of sacred chant in Judaism, as I know there is in Islam and in Buddhism as well. I think, I've never studied this, but I think it's impossible to sing in the midst of really debilitating, painful emotion, right? So if I sing, particularly either a wordless melody, which is important in Jewish tradition, beloved in Jewish tradition, or attached to a sacred phrase, which invokes the presence of the divine, which invokes God as protector. Even if some people use this in the classical tradition, the idea is that God is God is a personal being who can come into the situation and offer protection. But even for those of us who have a non-personal understanding of God, but to say God is to invoke the vastness and steadiness of the universe. Anything that I sing, as in, I place you, God, before me always. That's a biblical verse. Mm. Or in your hand, I place my soul when I wake and when I sleep, taken as metaphor. If I sing a beloved, or Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, a very beloved Jewish prayer with its origins in Deuteronomy. If I chant any one of those, either with the words or with the words in my mind as I chant a wordless melody, again, first of all, it enforces a pause from the pouring kerosene on the anxious stories, and it brings me into a different reality. And then one other, or using one of those same powerful verses that evoke the divine or evoke vastness or the oneness of creation is to breathe in synchrony with those words. So if I take one of those verses and cut them in half, and I recite in my mind's eye half of the verse on the in-breath, the other half of the verse on the out-breath, before very long, I'm calmer. It's so simple, as I said before. The hard part is remembering.
I wonder if we could talk more about the body. There's this great book, The Body Keeps Score, that was very influential recently, and a lot of scientific research showing that fear and anxiety are stored in the body, but also that the body's a way to release. Like, Zachary talked about raising your hands as a way, and Rabbi Eilberg, you talked about this mindful high five I never heard about before, which I like, and of course, watching your breath. But I wonder, and especially for an audience of non-believers, I know we're talking a little bit about, some religious practices, but for non-religious people, I wonder if any of you could elaborate more on specific methods to use your body to understand how you're storing anxiety and process it out somehow.
I have something that's also a practice that relates to this, and I think often about, there is a researcher and meditation teacher, and he does a lot of research on compassion meditation, called Paul Gilbert, and he's based in the UK, and a lot of the listeners are probably familiar with him. And he talks about different emotional regulation systems, and he talks about the drive system, the threat system, and the soothing system. And so what's happening, as we've all referred to, is when the threat system is activated, there's a certain physiology in the body, certain chemicals released, certain parts of the brain light up and so forth. So when that's constantly lit up due to the immediate threats or the imagined, expected threat, yes, then those chemicals are just keep being released in the body. Everybody's familiar with post-traumatic stress disorder, this idea that we can have these experiences that then get triggered by various stimulus. So one of the things that Paul Gilbert talks about that really relates to Buddhist practice is, can we activate the soothing system? And then that gives us more resourcing and more resilience. It actually activates the parasympathetic nervous system and these soothing, activation in the brain and in the body with the chemicals, oxytocin and other chemicals in the body. And so the beautiful thing is we do that through what we call in Tibetan Buddhism, the four immeasurables, or what's called in other Buddhist traditions, the four Brahma Viharas, and that's practices of equanimity, loving kindness, compassion, and empathetic joy. And so by engaging in these practices, we actually strengthen that soothing emotional regulation system so that it can, come back online more quickly, be more accessible, become more of our default mode. And then I think for that, it keeps us, it's so easy to be in threat. Amy mentioned Rick Hansen, and he has this, he talks about the negativity bias that our brain has. And he says our brain is like Velcro for negative experiences and like Teflon for positive experiences. And of course, that also helped us survive. As he often also says, you can miss lunch any number of times. You can only be lunch once, right? So we're hyper aware of threats and negativity. So we need to, build up these other systems, which we can do through our contemplative practice. Amy mentioned choice. So we choose to build up these other systems. And it doesn't mean that we're stupid and ignore real threats, but especially if we notice ourselves. And the last couple of years have been so hard. Like Amy mentioned, anxiety being the unknown. And there's been so many unknowns, like the beginning of COVID. We had no idea. You're just afraid of a virus that you can't even see that could be anywhere. We left our mail on the front porch for 4 days and disinfected our groceries. Like there was so much unknown. The climate crisis, the political, the four of us on this call are all from the Bay Area in Northern California in the US. Our political system, many countries have these, kind of unknown threats. Like we know just the general theme of it, but how to actually address it is unknown. So I think for that, turning to these beautiful practices that Zach and Amy described in Buddhism, building up that soothing system. So that's balancing out that sense of pervasive threat that we often have.
Any other thoughts on this, the body, from either Rabbi Eilberg or Zach?
Not so much on the body, but something else came to mind.
Yeah.
So with your permission, of course, the time of COVID has been so incredibly hard in so many ways. It's not over, but it's less intense now. So it's been like the equivalent of a 2-year intensive retreat focused on powerlessness, right? So it's been essential for spiritual leaders and civic leaders to respond, to people's pain and distress, which has been so deep. And there's also an opportunity in times that evoke anxiety. We were all, with all due compassion, right? We were all freaking out because we didn't know what tomorrow would bring. And that was terrifying. The truth is we never know what tomorrow will bring, but it's not usually, that insight is not usually so palpably real. It's real when a loved one is dying, right? Sorry for the distraction in the back. It's been real all the way through COVID, and that's been really hard to tolerate. But I think spiritual teachings that, as opposed to sort of 20th, 21st century Western life, which denies this basic reality, spiritual teachings that invite us to sink in to the awareness that we as human beings don't know what's going to happen next. Although that's bad news, that can also help us drop into, I mean, it almost feels physical, right? Drop into a place inside where we don't so much crave the pseudo knowledge of what's going to happen next and what am I going to do next. But we're in our centers, we know that we are finite and don't control everything. And much as we don't always like that, this beautiful life that we have is based in tremendous uncertainty always.
I'll jump in, and I really just love learning from sort of this practical wisdom of Rabbi Amy and Tenzin. In terms of the body, we often juxtapose, of course, the body and the soul or the spirit, and thinking that only the soul or the spirit is sacred. And in many religions, including Islam, the body is actually seen as pure and sacred. And there's one hadith sacred saying where God says through Muhammad, "And when I love someone, I become the hearing by which they hear, the sight by which they see, the hand by which they grasp, and the foot by which they walk." And to this, I would add that the opposite is also true. When we cultivate fear or hatred, and that can even be passively, for example, through our consumption of media, which can lead to a lot of fear and anxiety. When we cultivate these qualities instead of courage and love, our bodies become vehicles for these qualities. And I do believe they can lead to disorders and diseases, or at least make us less capable of healing. And the connection between the mind, body, and soul is, of course, well known to practitioners of Chinese, Ayurvedic, Tibetan, and Islamic medicine. And, I've had the privilege of being treated by practitioners of Chinese and Islamic medicine and also Ayurvedic medicine. And it's really, something that I would recommend for those who are suffering in some way and want to realign their body with, their heart, their mind, and their spirit. And in Islam, specifically with the body, we cultivate this connection again through the 5 daily prayers, where the mind, the body, and the soul are all devoted to God. And it's not unlike certain kinds of yoga. And so by connecting to the source of peace and love and these wonderful qualities, then those qualities can radiate through our bodies, through our minds, and through all of our actions, including how we interact with others.
If I may, just to add one piece to ditto onto Zach's beautiful teaching about the way the body is seen in Islam. I think probably the same is true for most religions that weren't primarily influenced by the Greco-Roman, period. In Judaism too, the separation of body and soul known in Western culture is actually unknown. But the piece that I wanted to add is that one of the first things that a religious Jew says upon awakening in the morning, not the very first thing is thank you, God, for having brought me back to life, but probably the next thing that one says is a blessing for the wondrous workings of the body, which is recited every time one goes to the bathroom. Blessed are you, our God, who has made the body with wondrous wisdom, with all of its openings and passageways. It's very sort of specific and elaborate. Blessed are you, O God, who works wonders. So I love teaching this to teenagers and preteens. Yes, there's a blessing for using the bathroom every time during the day, so that there is not that sense of the punitive or negative or adversarial relationship with the body, so that ideally that kind of practice of finding God, noticing God again and again and again over the course of the day in the workings of the body can encourage and inspire a sense of really wanting to embrace and honor whatever the body is doing, say, in the presence of anxiety, even when it's uncomfortable.
A couple of you brought up Rick Hansen, who integrates a lot of psychology and evolutionary psychology in talking about how to gain control of our minds and anxiety. And I wonder if any of you could talk a little bit about the way that we evolved. A lot of the evolutionary psychologists say that because we evolved in tribes, we have a natural bias towards the people we recognize, about 150 people that we recognize, and then everyone else who we're sort of terrified of. And I wonder if any of you could comment a little bit on that, and the really harsh part of that, of how fear and anxiety turned into hatred and violence, but then also how we learn to respect differences between people. Even seemingly very kind, compassionate people, I often see throw up their hand and say, like, I don't understand them. How could they believe that? So how do we get to the point of getting beyond that evolutionary bias against people who don't share our beliefs or who we don't recognize?
I would love to jump in, because this is something I think about so much. And, I think much is made of our innate tribalism.
Mhm.
And people say, studies done that infants prefer faces of people that look like them and so forth. And whereas that's true, there's also a lot of research showing we are also innately empathic and
Mhm.
compassionate towards other humans and even other species. We'll just leave it at humans for the purpose of this discussion. So much research showing, and there's a researcher here in the Bay Area, Dr. Keltner, who's from the Greater Good Science Center at the University of California in Berkeley. And he's written a whole book called Born to Be Good, talking about all the research showing that we have that empathy and that compassion. And I actually teach, as one of the things that I do, I teach conflict management skills also, and mediation skills. And in that and the compassion teaching that I do, we talk about connecting to this common humanity. And we often show a model of an iceberg, and coming out of the level of the water is a position. Like, you can have a political position, but below the waterline and overlapping with all the other icebergs are ordinary human interests and needs, which is what we have in common. And so we can focus on differences of appearance and religion and dress and opinions and attitudes, but tapping into that common humanity, which is a big part of the compassion training that I do that was developed at Stanford, is, hey, at the level of our common humanity, we all have the same emotions. We evolved the same emotions. We have the same basic human needs. We all want belonging, we want safety, we want dignity and respect. We all have the same emotions. And so again, the choice to focus on that part and not on the differences that we have. There's a beautiful book that is called The Heart of Altruism, and it was written by somebody called Kristen Monroe, and she was researching altruism and when people kind of went above and beyond to care for others, even at great personal cost. And she has this section of the book where she talked about European Gentiles who harbored Jews during World War II at great personal risk. If they were found out, they and their whole families would be killed. We all know the story of Anne Frank, and, hidden in the attic by the family. And so there are many examples like that. And what she found when she asked them, why did you do it? They all said, well, they're human beings just like me. How could I not? They were another human. So the emphasis was on the common humanity and not on the differences. They didn't see these people as other in any way. They just related to that common humanity. So I think these days there are a lot of movements to try to foster that kind of connection and bridging and understanding about the commonalities. I'm thinking of the Human Library that was started in Europe during the Syrian refugee crisis, the Bridging Differences, StoryCorps. There's so many kind of movements to try to get people to, it's just a shift of perspective, but we've got that as innately as we do our tribalism. And so it's just a question of fostering that.
Mhm.
So I agree. I agree again with everything that you say, except that you make it sound easy. I know you know that it isn't easy. I do think, obviously, not a scholar of this, but of all the sort of popular versions of evolutionary biology that I've read, it resonates as true to me that in ancient times, and some of that is lodged in there, in the more ancient parts of our brain, when someone was appeared over the horizon, not from my tribe, that person was not a friend coming for tea. They were, so there is that inbred assumption, as if the body has assumptions, or tendency to see the stranger, however that's defined, by race, by religion, by political persuasion, as the enemy, as a threat, and just say incidentally, not incidentally, really. For a long time, I couldn't understand, why do people get so ferocious in their political arguments? And I think there is some sense of threat, not to my physical integrity, but when I hear someone saying something that's so completely anathema to me, there is a physiological reaction that I can notice, something, a kind of recoiling, which is something akin to fear of, like, how can I live in a world that has such views in it? So I think that although empathy is also hardwired, as they say, and the most obvious example is the parental love is fierce and incredibly powerful. Yes, and that's also inbred. I think it really is hard work to override the stranger anxiety part of us. I once had a psychologist talk to me about anteriorizing, right? When to the extent that our reaction personally is coming from, the limbic area in the back, when we can shift our energy and our, physical response to the more reflective, more advanced reflective parts of the brain, that's when we can think and reflect and pause and make decisions. Although it sounds easy and obvious, I think in a way we need to evolve past that feature of our brains. I agree with Tenzin that we can choose to cultivate other parts of the brain. Obviously, that it's definitely clear to me that that's part of the story. And on some level, I think we need to get over the other, as a human race. If climate doesn't destroy us, the other thing that might destroy us is our hatred of the other, right? And we need to evolve past it. Yeah. So for me, it is that big. There are ways, and it is daunting, I think.
I just wanted to jump in real quick. Absolutely not easy. It seems that a lot of it really depends on exposure, seeking out who we have, we notice that we have maybe a bias against, and seeking out with curiosity. There's a thinker based again in the UK called Roman Krznaric, and he talks about the 6 habits of highly empathic people. And one of those is choosing to have conversations with people that we think of as other. And that's what some of these movements that I mentioned really set that up, as a way, like maybe you've never met a transgender person and you have all of these ideas about what somebody like that is like. And then after a half-hour conversation, you're never going to be able to hold so strongly to those stereotypes. So like you say, Amy, we evolved that when the hunter-gatherer from the other tribe coming over the hill was a threat, but we live in just such an interconnected global reality. So it is up to us to seek out opportunities to overcome, that innate tribalism that we have. Yeah.
Totally agree. And as my fellow speakers know, I was recently in Israel, Palestine, so I have, Israel, Palestine on the brain. There have been many programs that have taken people, but especially teenagers and young adults, often out of the region to a camp in Maine or, in other places to have facilitated just facilitated human interaction and dialogue about the program. And it's clear that the programs are transformative, and people, at the first night were afraid to sleep in the same room as the Palestinian or as the Jewish Israeli, but then, sobbed uncontrollably on the last day because, how am I going to live without you now? The humanization had turned so much to love. But then the after studies depressingly say that you put those kids or those young people back in the conflict zone, and they're surrounded by regular news of violence and hatred. And they're surrounded again more immediately by loved ones who haven't had the exposure therapy, who are still living the conflict narrative. I used to think, once you've had one of those experiences, you could never, ever go back. And I have grown more questioning about that, put people back into the toxic environment again. And that part of the brain of the self can be reactivated. I mean, the answer to that is it needs to be ongoing work. It needs to be ongoingly cultivated. Yeah.
These are fascinating insights, and I agree. And going back to this question, just around how is it that we as human beings develop this kind of fear and anxiety? Throughout much of the U.S., Europe, even in India and Myanmar, we see a rise in xenophobia, which literally means the fear of the stranger or guest. And some biologists have remarked that this fear may be due in part to the fear of diseases and plagues, such as what the indigenous peoples of the Americas and elsewhere confronted when European colonialists began arriving in 1492. We also know that social distancing is a wise and compassionate response to pandemics like COVID. However, I think in normal circumstances, I think we're called to learn about and celebrate our differences. There's a wonderful verse of the Quran, "O humanity, we created you from a male and a female and made you into races and tribes that you may come to know one another." Elsewhere in the Quran, diversity of human races, tribes, nations, religions, and languages are seen as so many signs of God or ways of beholding the sacred. Thus, instead of fearing or hating other human beings, we're encouraged to learn about and help one another. The Quran, also back to this more sort of fundamental question, the Quran does describe friends of God or saints who've transcended fear or grief. And in addition to Muslims, it also adds Jews, Christians, Sabians, any who believe in God and the day of judgment and do good. They shall not be fearful, nor shall they grieve in the next world. So there's a sense that there's more than one path that can lead us beyond fear and towards peace. And I think really in, as I said earlier, in the experience of our differences, we not only behold other people, but the sacred itself.
So beautiful, Zach. If I may, I might have sounded like such a downer before. I certainly am not a person who says, "Oh well, it's hopeless. The brain is against us, so there's nothing to be done." have, spent a great deal of my life working to help people cultivate the habits of peace building in interreligious and intergroup contexts and interpolitical contexts. So I believe with all my heart in that work, and that it's not just about, I was talking with someone recently, it's not just about discovering our commonalities, as is often common, I think, and simplistic notion of interfaith dialogue, is that, we reach the point where we're all the same. Don't you see? If you really look beneath all the differences, we're all the same, which in a sense is to say, I can humanize and even love you if I discover that you're just like me. But if you actually, if my husband sees in me only the parts that are just like me, he's not seeing all of me. And so what kind of love is that? So certainly, the process of coming to know the other, religious other, the racial, political other, whatever it is about honoring the great beauty and variety. And that is something that we're capable of as human beings. We just need to remember, again, there's some sort of pushing beyond a certain instinct. And I just want to throw another thing in. Zach and Tenzin, I think, have both talked about kind of an epidemic of fear, hyper-nationalism, in the world in which we live. And so I think, as a layperson in this, that a lot of what's so crazy about the world now, and so frightening and violent and hateful about the world right now, is derivative of, is a response, people's response to a period of accelerated social change, and across the globe. Including, globalization is itself tremendous change, and brings with it, tremendous other social and economic and political changes, and that pace of change, that level of really profound change, equality of races and different genders and orientations and gender expressions, and whatever that may be, it feels like the world is moving very fast. So much as, I have my moments reading the newspaper of like, people should just get over it and learn that, we're learning a lot of new things. So, hallelujah, what a blessing that we get to learn new things, and the world is advancing in many different ways. And it's so profoundly unsettling. So that's how I understand why there's so many horrible governments in particular at this time, all at this time in the world. So as I say that, I'm reminded that part of the answer to all of this is having compassion for ourselves and everyone else. It always has been hard to be a human being, hard to live in a body and heart and spirit that are finite and vulnerable to loss. It's always been hard to be a human being. I think it's especially, in some ways, especially hard to be a human being right now. If we could only notice with each, human being, including the person that I read about in the newspaper, picking up the newspaper from my kitchen table, who says, something utterly outrageous. That person too, short of hurting someone else directly, but at least in their thinking, is doing the best they can, struggling their way through a difficult life. So again, I'm just saying the obvious, that compassion is the answer.
And that's what I love about, we've been on so many of these panels and conversations together. And I remember one time that Amy and I and three other faith leaders were talking at a panel for the Parliament of World Religions. And one of the prompts was, please say one of the most important principles of your faith tradition. I remember so clearly, all five of us, so Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Buddhist, and Hindu, we all talked about compassion, and we hadn't planned it ahead of time. And it was just this beautiful moment of, yeah, and I think, what Zach, this beautiful verses and sentiments that Zach just shared. And that's one of the things I've always admired so much about Islam, is just how built in this care for the stranger is, as just a religious and cultural value, and just how important compassion is in all of our faith traditions. And it just makes me think, as I'm listening to Amy and Zach, it's sort of the function of religion is to give us tools to overcome our innate tribalism and the worst of our human nature, in a way, and that negativity bias that we have. I mean, that's one way of characterizing religious traditions, is the way to, kind of foster those better angels of our nature and overcome the default mode. And I think that's what we've all been talking about in our own ways, but compassion definitely being the key. And it was so beautiful, that moment. This is like, when was it, Amy? Like a year and a half or 2 years ago, that we were all talking about compassion at the Parliament of World Religions. It was a very sweet moment.
Let me ask you one more question before we go to the audience. And if you each have a lot of wisdom on anxiety and some of the ways of treating it, if resources weren't an issue, what would be one intervention you would make in society to actually reduce anxiety and foster, compassion, closeness, and so on, peace of mind?
Well,
I've seen. Please go ahead, Tenzin.
Go ahead. No, go ahead, Zach. Go ahead, please.
I've seen studies that show that access to greenery, to parks, to nature, really does wonders for the psychological and emotional well-being of kids. And I think that's also true for adults. And of course, we have this crisis of global warming. So if we can plant more trees, if we can cultivate urban gardens that can feed people, and simply start to order our lives in ways that provide access to nature, I think that will go a long way.
And I think, Zach mentioned children, and it made me think of, more of compassion training and emotional regulation training, in schools for children. I mean, when I teach these trainings, and I go, nobody ever taught me this when I was growing up. And there are some programs around, but, just giving people strategies and introducing these ideas. I think when people are young, up until COVID, I was teaching in prisons for about 15 years, and then I stopped with COVID and the prisons shut down. But I'd have like a group of 30 or 35, men in for violent crimes in their 40s and 50s, usually, like trying to learn these things and so engaged. And I thought, oh, if somebody had gotten this guy when he was 15, like he never would have done the offense that has him doing a life sentence right now. And so I would always think, oh my gosh, an intervention at the front end to really teach some of these skills. That would be my wish.
Nice. Rabbi Eilberg.
Those were brilliant and beautiful, Zach and Tenzin. I'm not thinking of anything sort of a finite, a really single finite intervention like that. I mean, what arose for me, Scott, when you raised the question, is that people need to have more of what they need. The society would have to be radically restructured to shift from prioritizing the financial needs of the wealthy, and instead to prioritize the well-being of everyone. For some, it's food and housing. For some, it's addiction treatment. So there's a whole range of that would require, really a reconstruction of society that ultimately would convey the sense that there really is enough for all of us if once we redistribute and once we assert that the reason that we are here together is to take care of one another, to take care of all of us.